Abraham is considered one of the most important figures in biblical history, a man chosen by God to establish a covenant that would shape the destiny of nations. His story, as told in the book of Genesis, is often viewed through the lens of faith, obedience, and divine calling. But what if there's more to the story than what we've traditionally been taught? What if Abraham's encounters with the divine were not solely spiritual experiences, but moments influenced by ancient beings known to the Sumerians as the Anunnaki? Long before the Bible was written, the Sumerians, the oldest known civilization, recorded their own sacred stories about powerful beings who came from the heavens. These beings were called the Anunnaki. Unlike abstract deities, the Anunnaki were described as real, present, and active in shaping human history. They weren't distant gods looking down from afar. They were depicted as direct participants in humanity's evolution, guiding civilizations, sharing knowledge, and even forming agreements with specific individuals. So the question arises, could the divine figures who guided Abraham have been these same celestial beings, later reinterpreted through the lens of biblical tradition? It's a provocative idea, but not without compelling parallels. The Bible tells us that Abraham was called to leave his homeland and promised that his descendants would become a great nation. He received this message through a voice from the heavens, which he accepted without hesitation. This event is typically described as God speaking directly to Abraham. However, the account is vague on the details. Was it a voice in his head, a vision, a physical being standing before him? These unanswered questions have opened the door to alternative interpretations. The Sumerian texts describe numerous encounters where the Anunnaki descended from the sky and gave direct instructions to human leaders. They also frequently made covenants binding agreements, promising land, prosperity, or divine favor in exchange for loyalty and obedience. These stories bear striking similarities to the events in Abraham's life, including his covenant with God, his test of faith, and the recurring theme of land inheritance. When we line these stories up side by side, it's hard not to notice the shared elements: celestial beings, promised blessings, symbolic rituals, and guidance that changes the course of human history. This doesn't necessarily mean that the story of Abraham is false or invalid. Instead, it opens the door to a broader understanding. What if the biblical narrative is part of a longer, older tradition, one that began not with Moses or the Hebrew patriarchs, but with the Sumerians and their records of the Anunnaki? What if the stories we know today are reinterpretations of real events involving ancient beings whose presence has been largely erased or rebranded over time? Exploring this possibility doesn't take away from the spiritual significance of Abraham's journey. In fact, it adds depth and complexity. It invites us to question where these stories come from, who shaped them, and whether there's a hidden layer of truth that connects human history not just to Earth, but to the stars. Could Abraham's covenant have been part of a greater cosmic plan? If so, it may be time to reconsider everything we think we know about the origins of faith and the forces that have guided humanity since the beginning. Before the Bible introduced us to a single, all-powerful God, the ancient Sumerians, the creators of one of the world's first civilizations, had already documented their own stories of divine beings who came from the heavens. These beings were called the Anunnaki. Unlike the distant, abstract concept of God that many of us are familiar with, the Anunnaki were described as physically real, visibly present, and deeply involved in the lives of humans. They didn't just watch from above. They walked among people, issued commands, and shaped the earliest civilizations. The Sumerians portrayed them not as metaphor or myth, but as powerful, celestial entities who brought order, knowledge, and structure to humanity's early days. The word Anunnaki itself is often translated as those who came from the heavens to earth, suggesting a direct, literal descent from the stars. In Sumerian art and literature, these beings are depicted arriving in flying objects, wearing elaborate gear and possessing tools or weapons that seemed far beyond the technology of their time. They were credited with teaching humans how to build cities, manage agriculture, govern societies, and even understand time and astronomy. In short, the Anunnaki weren't just visitors, they were architects of civilization. This portrayal is a far cry from the spiritual beings we read about in the modern Bible. But what if they're connected? What if the Anunnaki didn't disappear from human memory, but instead were reinterpreted over time, gradually transformed into the angels, messengers, and even the god figures of later texts? This idea might sound controversial, but when we trace the evolution of divine narratives from Sumerian to biblical literature, the parallels are hard to ignore. For example, in the Sumerian accounts, the Anunnaki often made covenants with select individuals, promising land, abundance, and favor in exchange for loyalty and obedience. These agreements were usually formalized through complex rituals involving fire, animals, and celestial signs, rituals remarkably similar to the covenant ceremony Abraham experienced in Genesis 15. The Anunnaki also descended at critical moments in history to redirect the course of human development, just as angels or divine figures appear throughout the Bible to give direction or deliver warnings. It's also important to note the Anunnaki's consistent connection to the stars. They were described as coming from specific constellations or celestial zones, and many Sumerian temples were aligned with astronomical markers. This isn't just poetic language. The Sumerians were expert astronomers, and they associated divine presence with actual locations in the sky. This focus on the stars echoes in the biblical story of Abraham, especially in the repeated imagery of his descendants being as numerous as the stars in the sky. Could this be a symbolic reference to something much older, a way of preserving ancient cosmic connections in a new theological framework? As we consider these possibilities, it's clear that the Anunnaki's influence may run deeper than previously thought. They may not have vanished, they may have been woven into the stories that form the foundation of modern faiths. Whether viewed as gods, extraterrestrials, or advanced beings misunderstood by early humans, the Anunnaki remain one of the most fascinating and mysterious parts of ancient history. If their influence reached as far as the life of Abraham, then we may need to revisit what we think we know about divine encounters, sacred texts, and the true origin of spiritual guidance. The story of Abraham is one of the most well-known narratives in the Bible. It's a story about faith, obedience, and a divine promise that changed the course of history. But when we look closer, especially in light of ancient Sumerian texts, we begin to notice something striking parallels that suggest Abraham's encounters may have shared more in common with the tales of the Anunnaki than we've been led to believe. These similarities raise a profound question. Were the beings who guided Abraham truly the singular God of biblical tradition, or could they have been ancient celestial beings like the Anunnaki who had already been shaping humanity long before the Hebrew scriptures were written? One of the clearest parallels lies in the idea of divine covenants. In Genesis 15, Abraham takes part in a strange and symbolic ritual. He is told to gather specific animals, cut them in half, and arrange the pieces opposite each other. Then, as he falls into a deep sleep, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch pass between the pieces, sealing the covenant between him and God. This scene stands out in the Bible, not just because of its dramatic imagery, but because it mirrors the kind of ceremonial agreements often described in Sumerian writings. The Anunnaki were known to establish covenants with humans through similar symbolic axe rituals involving sacrifice, fire, and celestial signs. Another powerful connection is the nature of the promise itself. God tells Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. This poetic imagery is often seen as metaphor, but when we view it alongside the Sumerian emphasis on the heavens, it takes on a deeper meaning. The Anunnaki were said to come from the stars, and their stories are steeped in celestial references. To them, the stars weren't just decoration, they were a map, a memory, and a message. The fact that Abraham's promise is framed in the same cosmic language raises the possibility that his story is part of a much older tradition that viewed the stars as central to human destiny. Even the moment Abraham is first called by God in Genesis 12 echoes patterns found in Sumerian accounts. He hears a voice urging him to leave his home with the promise of land and legacy. But the Bible gives few details about this encounter. There's no clear description of who or what Abraham saw. Was it just a voice in his head, a dream? Or was it a physical being, like those described in Sumerian texts, beings who came down from the heavens to give guidance? The ambiguity leaves room for interpretation, and the Sumerian narratives help fill in some of the blank. The binding of Isaac in Genesis 22 is another pivotal moment with potential connections. Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his beloved son, only to be stopped at the last moment by a divine messenger. This test of faith is shocking, but it also mirrors Sumerian stories in which humans were required to demonstrate loyalty through symbolic acts of obedience. In both traditions, these tests are not just about proving faith, they're about establishing a deeper bond between human and divine. Taken together, these parallels suggest that Abraham's story may not exist in a vacuum. Instead, it could be the continuation or reinterpretation of a much older legacy, one in which powerful beings from the stars played an active role in guiding human destiny. Over time, the stories that shape our understanding of faith and human history have been edited, curated, and in many cases, rewritten. This isn't just speculation, it's historical fact. The Bible, as we know it today, is the result of centuries of translation, interpretation, and selective inclusion. Books like Genesis were passed down orally before being written, and then further filtered through religious councils, political agendas, and cultural shifts. During this process, many ancient texts that offered deeper, even controversial insights were removed or disregarded. Among these were writings that described divine beings descending to Earth, stories that echoed the accounts of the Anunnaki found in Sumerian tablets. Could it be that the connections between Abraham's story and the Anunnaki were deliberately left out, hidden to preserve a specific narrative? One of the clearest examples is the Book of Enoch, a text that expands on Genesis 6, where sons of God come down to Earth and interact with humans. In Enoch, these beings called the Watchers teach forbidden knowledge, influence humanity, and disrupt the natural order. These stories closely resemble the Sumerian descriptions of the Anunnaki, who are said to share wisdom, technology, and even genetic material with humans. Yet the Book of Enoch was excluded from the official biblical canon. Why? Possibly because it introduced ideas that challenged the concept of a singular, all-powerful God and suggested that multiple beings were involved in humanity's early development. The suppression didn't end there. For centuries, mainstream scholars and religious institutions labeled Sumerian texts as myth, despite their advanced knowledge and uncanny parallels to biblical events. These ancient writings were buried literally and metaphorically for thousands of years before being rediscovered in the 19th century. When researchers began translating them, they found stories of creation, floods, divine covenants, and celestial guidance, many of which predate the Bible. But instead of embracing these connections, many academics dismissed them as primitive mythology. This dismissal helped keep the Anunnaki out of mainstream religious conversations. Why would this information be downplayed or ignored? One major reason is control. A simplified story, one God, one chosen people, one path makes faith easier to organize and institutionalize. It allows religious leaders to offer clear answers and enforce uniform beliefs. Introducing the idea of the Anunnaki, a group of powerful beings possibly connected to the stars, complicates this framework. It raises difficult questions. Were these beings divine, extraterrestrial? Were they responsible for humanity's development? And if so, what does that mean for traditional religious authority? Another factor is fear of what these ancient truths might reveal. If Abraham's encounters were influenced by celestial beings like the Anunnaki, then the foundations of modern religion rest on something far more complex than most people have been told. That idea can be uncomfortable. It challenges long-held beliefs and invites a level of uncertainty that many institutions would rather avoid. But in today's age of information, these hidden connections are resurfacing. Independent researchers, open-source texts, and digital archives are making it harder to suppress alternative views of ancient history. The celestial themes in Abraham's story, the stars, the messengers, the ritual mirror what the Sumerians described thousands of years ago. Perhaps the truth has been hiding in plain sight all along. We just haven't been encouraged to look deeper until now. One of the most striking and poetic elements in the story of Abraham is the repeated reference to the stars. In Genesis 15:5, God tells Abraham to look up at the night sky and count the stars, so shall your offspring be. At first glance, this might seem like simple symbolism meant to express the vastness of Abraham's future legacy. But when viewed through the lens of ancient traditions, especially those from Sumer, the celestial imagery takes on a deeper and possibly more literal meaning. The Sumerians, who lived thousands of years before the Bible was written, held the stars in high regard not just as part of nature, but as the realm of the divine. Their stories of the Anunnaki, beings said to have descended from the heavens, consistently tie these figures to specific constellations and star systems. This connection raises an intriguing possibility. Was the promise made to Abraham more than a metaphor? Could it reflect a real, ancient link between humanity and the stars? In Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki were often referred to as those who came from the heavens to earth. Their guidance wasn't abstract. It was direct, intentional, and deeply tied to celestial events. Temples were aligned with the stars. Rituals were performed based on planetary movements. The sky was not just a backdrop, it was a source of divine order and instruction. The same themes appear in Abraham's covenant. The stars mark the promise. The heavens serve as witness. This isn't coincidental. The Bible, though written much later, seems to carry echoes of these much older traditions. It's as if the story of Abraham is part of a longer cosmic narrative that predates the biblical record. Modern researchers like Billy Carson have pointed out that celestial imagery in ancient texts often signals a deeper truth, one rooted in humanity's forgotten connection to advanced beings from the stars. He suggests that stories like Abraham's may be reinterpreted versions of real encounters with such beings, woven into a spiritual framework to preserve their significance across generations. When Abraham looks up to the stars and receives a divine promise, it's not just poetic, it might reflect an ancient memory, a moment of cosmic alignment where something greater than ourselves reached down to guide our future. It's also worth noting how stars are used throughout sacred texts. In the New Testament, a star leads the wise men to the birth of Jesus. In prophetic writings, stars fall from the sky to signal great change. In both Sumerian and biblical accounts, stars are not passive, they are active participants in the human story. They represent destiny, divine presence, and higher knowledge. Abraham's promise, framed through this celestial lens, suggests that his covenant wasn't just about lineage or land. It was about reconnecting humanity with its cosmic origins. This raises a powerful question. Are we as a species subconsciously remembering a time when our ancestors interacted with beings from beyond this world? Is our fascination with the stars, our desire to explore the cosmos and search for life beyond Earth, an echo of something much older, buried deep in our spiritual memory? Abraham's legacy is often described as spiritual, but perhaps it's also celestial. The stars were not just symbols of his descendants, they may have been a clue to where we truly come from and who might have helped shape our path. The covenant, then, is more than a religious promise. It's a reminder that our story may be written not just in Scripture, but in the stars themselves. Abraham's story has endured for thousands of years, not just because it's central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but because it speaks to something deeper in the human experience, the search for purpose, identity, and connection with something greater than ourselves. Traditionally, we see Abraham as a man of faith who listened to God, followed divine commands, and became the father of nations. But when we begin to explore the possibility that his journey was influenced by ancient beings like the Anunnaki beings described in Sumerian texts as those who came from the heavens, the meaning of his story expands in unexpected ways. It transforms from a tale of obedience into a bridge between humanity and the stars, between earthbound faith and cosmic history. Throughout the biblical account, Abraham encounters beings who give him specific instructions, make bold promises, and even test his loyalty in dramatic ways. These interactions bear remarkable resemblance to stories found in Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts, where the Anunnaki engage with chosen individuals, guiding their actions, blessing their offspring, and even shaping the destinies of nations. The rituals, the celestial language, and the focus on legacy all point to a much older narrative that may have been carried forward and reinterpreted through the lens of Hebrew spirituality. If that's the case, Abraham wasn't just a religious figure, he may have been a key part of humanity's forgotten origin story, a human chosen to be the link between our world and something far beyond it. What makes this possibility even more powerful is what it implies about us today. If Abraham's covenant was not only spiritual but also celestial, rooted in interactions with advanced beings who sought to guide and uplift humanity, then perhaps our history is more mysterious and more interconnected with the cosmos than we've been told. It challenges the idea that we're alone or disconnected. It invites us to re-examine not just religion, but human potential. And it encourages us to question what else might have been hidden, lost, or rebranded throughout history to fit a simpler, more manageable narrative. But beyond the ancient mysteries and cosmic theories, Abraham's story, whether influenced by the Anunnaki or not, still offers us something deeply relevant today. He was called to step into the unknown, to leave behind the familiar, and to trust a greater vision for his life. That takes courage. It takes faith not just in a divine power, but in the process, in the unseen path ahead. In many ways, we are all walking our own version of that journey. We each face moments when we're asked to take a leap, to follow a calling we can't fully explain, to believe in a purpose we can't yet see. In a world that often feels chaotic and disconnected, Abraham's story, especially when viewed through this expanded cosmic lens, reminds us that we are part of something much bigger. Whether you see that something is God, the Anunnaki, the universe, or simply the legacy of those who came before us, the message is the same. We are not here by accident. Our lives have meaning, and our choices ripple through time. So, the lesson is this: don't be afraid to ask deeper questions. Don't be afraid to explore the mysteries. And when your moment comes to walk into the unknown, like Abraham did, trust that you're part of a much greater story still unfolding. One that may stretch far beyond Earth, into the stars where it all may have begun.